last time we talked about how language grows brains, and did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was giving you some thought, and one of the things that I learned through the years was that there's an absolute connection between learning, like just what we would call a word, which is actually a concept. Like, let's say you have a young child, and they, you've talked to them, interact with them, and finally they say kitty or doggy. What we have to realize is that being able to utter doggy or kitty or whatever, milk, means that in the brain, neurons have been connected enough to start to form. They strengthen, and then they start to bond together. And the idea of being able to say something as simple as kitty means that you now have a neural circuit of neurons that have bonded together. The brain grows when enough of those circuits begin to connect into networks, and then it is the white matter that grows. Wait, which one?
Well, the white matter.
The white matter starts to grow, which is actually most of your brain, right?
Right. Well, it's the lipoprotein, the fatty protein that wraps around the neurons. And so it turns the pathways, which are kind of slow circuits, that turns those into really fast ones.
Like superhighways,
yeah,
right?
Superhighways.
So the more of those circuits into networks, the more efficiency we get, the more we can learn new ideas, because there's more places to connect the old ideas to new ideas onto. So when I say language grows brains, I'm being very literal. That as we use language with others, children or adults, I always say children because I've worked with children most of my life. When we use language with them and they acquire a new concept and they can represent it with their language, like talking about ants or talking about penguins, they've actually grown new connections in their brain.
Absolutely.
Just physically growing their brain. And it's exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting. So between 0 and 7, we've got these brains that are really picking up information from outside, the sensor input. And it's going so fast, and there's so many features that have to be picked up so quickly. And everything is new. Everything is new. So that means that the brain has to be able to process all of that new information. So the brain is just like on fire if you look at it from an imaging standpoint. It's just like, oh my gosh, almost overload, everything's coming in. But what's interesting about the brain is it doesn't ever really get overloaded.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
Because it starts to sort out, oh, I've seen that before. Oh, I've heard that before. Oh, I know what that is. And then what happens is that those those same connections begin to get pruned. It's kind of like we can't overgrow the bush. There's only so much, space, and we have to become more efficient. So it's like, okay, I've already heard that. And by now we have a connection that's not only connecting a circuit, but it's turning on the lights, literally. So I'm now creating images in my head that are visual. And I'm also creating images that could be auditory for some of us, sound-based. And that means then when I hear that sound, I hear that or see that visual. When I get those patterns coming in, it's like, oh, we can quickly we know what it is. We understand it. And so those images are now meaningful. Okay, as you said, concepts. Well, that's why they're called neurosemantic circuits, because of the meaningfulness, and neurosemantic networks, because the circuits pretty much, if you have one concept, you're going to have multiple connections to multiple circuits.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and so neuro being brain,
right?
Brain-based, and semantic being meaningful.
Right.
And there's been some really amazing work done by Frederick Muller, right? Where he has a linguistic background.
And all of his lab. He's got labs and people connections around the world.
Neuroscientist with a linguistic background. So he really was curious about what does language do in the brain? How can we figure this out?
Right.
And so this work on the neural circuitry and the lighting up of the brain and the pruning is coming a lot from his work, because he's starting to prove it, which is amazing.
Yeah. And in education or in psychology, we typically say that we can't prove anything, but we can support it.
Yeah.
And so, because that's what science is all about.
That's a good point.
Science is asking a question, based upon observations, and then going and collecting data about it. And then once you've collected that data, you come back through and say, oh, okay, that supports this, until the next piece of data comes through, and the next piece of science comes through.
Because science is never settled.
Yeah,
We're always, especially the brain. My goodness.
Exactly.
Right?
We just keep adding and adding and adding. And one of the issues that has to do with language in the brain is that we don't all have the same definition of language.
Yep.
Okay, so, I thought maybe our audience would like to know a little bit about how we view language. And I've had the opportunity, I see it as a blessing, an opportunity to basically look at language from a couple of major approaches, okay? And one approach is to look at language as most of us who are speakers think of it because of the way we've been taught. And that is that, language consists of vocabulary. So the people that are out there watching this, if you've been doing any kind of vocabulary, maybe you think back to your 5th grade classroom and that teacher is getting you ready for middle school and they wanted you to learn vocabulary. They were working on the structures of language. Words are structures, okay? Or maybe that 4th grade teacher wanted you to take and find all the nouns and all the verbs. Well, those are parts of speech. That's also structure.
And we often, I think of that as surface structure as well.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the top layer, just that the part you can see, because you can actually say, oh, that's a verb, that's a noun. I can sort that, right?
Yeah.
And those little surface structures of language. And that's what most people think, because most books on acquiring language say, well, learn the verbs and then, or learn the nouns and learn the verbs, and then you'll be okay. And then learn how they connect and learn some adjectives.
Here's a vocabulary. How many words does a kid have? Yeah, exactly. And then, there are a couple other things. Maybe you had to memorize articles, and then you had to maybe do something with prepositions. You had to learn what that was, that type of thing. And then you think, well, now I'm in high school or in college, and maybe I'll take ASL, American Sign Language, or maybe I'll take Chinese. And you get into those and you go, wait a minute. What happened to all those S's for plural? And what happened to all those prepositions? What happened to all those articles?
And all the past tense.
Yeah, and all the past tense. Because Mandarin, for example, doesn't have those. Mandarin Chinese. That language is not like English or French or German, okay? It's very different, okay? Because the people that assign meaning to what was meaningful to them culturally and linguistically thought differently, okay? So, wait a minute.
So English isn't the same as Navajo?
No, it's
Swahili?
not. No, or most of the indigenous languages, okay?
Yeah.
And so that means then that our thinking, okay, which is the way in which we perceive what our environment's like and the way people have assigned meaning, because we've said we have to develop this language in this environment, okay, that means that we also are thinking differently.
Right, because language grows the brain.
Right.
So a different type of language is going to, therefore, change kind of the wiring of the brain and what is emphasized and what neural anatomy is given its most, real estate in a way, like what it's going to activate more.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there are people who actually look at languages and look at the structures. Okay,
right.
Language. The linguist out there, is fabulous.
Right.
We need that. We need to know. I want to know everything about English. I want to know.
That's where that international phonetic alphabet comes from, like being able to tag all the part, and also parts of speech. But that's different for that. But the fact that they can name every sound, and that's what linguists do.
Some of them do. Phonologists do that.
Oh, okay.
Phone has to do with sound. PHON. It has to do with sound, and so like anything that you see with that PHON at the beginning has to do with sound. So a phonologist is somebody who specializes in looking at the study of sound in a language, okay?
Right, but still surface structure.
But ASL doesn't have sound.
That's true.
Okay.
That's true. Yeah.
So anyway, and we're gonna. That's all right. We'll come back to that. That's fine. So the structures then would include things like the sounds, okay? It would include things like how do you put the words together, okay? We don't do it like the people who speak German. We don't do it in English like you do it in Latin or in ancient.
You start studying synthetic and analytic languages and go, wait a second. The way we put that's why those German words have they're like
long,
this long.
That's
they're just
right.
chunking stuff on as opposed
and you're putting a lot of verbs at the end.
Yeah.
Okay. Whereas you probably, if in your 4th grade class, were told that you look for the nouns first and then you look for the verbs. Well, that's because English is a subject, verb, object language. Okay. And today, I know that as we were talking and before we started to sit down and do the podcast, I know that we probably use some kind of a simple sentence like a predicate nominative, and that's a copula to be. And if you're sitting there going as an audience, wait a minute, what's a predicate nominative?
I just kind of did, actually.
And what is a copula to be?
Yeah.
Well, it's a simple sentence that this is. Okay, like this is big. The girl is tall. Okay, so the tall actually modifies the girl.
Right.
Okay, and that's what a predicate nominative has to do with the verb to be, which is a copula, which connects other verbs either as an auxiliary or as a standalone. You don't have to know that to learn language.
Somehow,
you don't
children
have to,
talk to you without
Yeah,
knowing
well, they don't
what
know
all
any
the parts
that.
of speech
They don't-
are.
Exactly. So language,
How is that
obviously,
possible?
structurally, yeah, it's syntax. My own field
Right,
defines
right.
it as syntax.
That's right.
The word order defines it as morphology,
Yeah.
putting the S's and INGs and those
Yeah,
kinds of things.
that's right.
And parts of speech and all of that. That's the morphology. Taking the smallest unit of meaning, the morph, and EME on the end of anything means meaning, and doing something with it. But then we also have what's called semantics, okay? But from a structural standpoint, semantics is just vocabulary,
That's true.
all right? So that's where there's a little bit of a crossover between two different approaches. One that's very structural, looking at all of what language consists of structurally that you can see, like you
Right.
said. And then there's this other stuff over here that we'll talk about in just a second. But it has to do with the semantics in both areas, but one is seen as words, vocabulary, and one is seen as meaning that's brain-based and environmentally based. And that's very different, okay? And then it seems like I'm leaving out one. We've got phonology, syntax, morphology, and semantics. Now I've got them all.
Yeah, you do.
Okay. And then sometimes people add what's known as pragmatics to that structure, which is when pragmatics is looked at structurally, it is your turn, Bonnie, and then you give me a turn, and then I
Right.
give you a turn.
Hello, how are you?
I am fine. How are you?
I'm good. What are you doing today?
I am walking.
See what I'm saying? So that's pragmatics. It's that
Yeah.
like on the surface structure. It's that
It's
given.
very-
There's like that greetings,
and it
kind of
sounds
things
that
like
way when you teach it.
Yeah.
When
If
you,
have
teach,
to
it,
teach it.
when you have to teach that, you have to take a turn, and this is what it looks like, and now you need to practice it. When you're practicing language, you're in the developmental structural end of what language is all
Surface,
about.
the surface structure, yeah.
So neuroscientists like Pulvermuller comes along, or anybody else, okay, it can be anybody, in education too, comes along, and we look and we say, okay, well, I know what language is because I use language, okay? And you go, okay, but how would you define language? Well, the kids have to have vocabulary, and they have to have how to do the noun verbs and noun phrases, verb phrases, that kind of thing. And you go, okay, you just described your language.
That's a
okay?
good point. So it's describing versus the use of, like the
acquisition.
describing versus the function of it,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Because there's a difference between describing a shirt and knowing the function of a shirt,
Absolutely. Or being able to
right?
wear it.
or being able to wear it.
Exactly.
Yeah, and put it on.
That's a really good analogy because that's a great one, because you go in and you're looking at the aisle and you go, oh, gee, that's a beautiful blouse.
Yeah.
Then I look at it and it's size 0. It's not going to fit.
Probably not gonna
know.
me either. No.
No.
Yeah, I'm not gonna buy the size 0, but I like the blouse. So,
Exactly.
but like, oh, I can describe it. It's beautiful,
Yeah.
but the function of it's not gonna work for me.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to. So that's the difference, right? So it's also, as a side note, hold the thought about function too, because we are talking not about languages.
No.
We're talking about language as a function, as a brain-based, yeah. But I want to make sure
Yeah.
that we understand that we're not talking about.
Yeah.
We're not here to describe like the differences necessarily between French and German and compare them.
But there are comparative linguists
There is
that do
comparative,
that.
yes, and it's
they
very
do that.
fascinating, and it does inform you if you're working with kids from other cultures and backgrounds in a way. But we're not talking about languages.
But
We're talking
it
about
is,
language.
yeah, and it is a specific type of approach that's
Yeah.
very valid for having certain types of outcomes. And the
Correct.
outcome is usually, I want to describe this language, and I want to compare this language to this language,
Right.
and they're not the same. And then you start asking the question why.
That's fascinating.
That's
too.
a big
Like,
question,
why
because that
did-
gets into
what
that
did they do?
function
Right.
piece,
That's
and you
right.
get into the why, and you
Yeah.
go, oh, culturally, they use language differently. Okay, culturally, they have different beliefs. That gets into our thinking now. Culturally, if their thinking and their beliefs and their ideas are different, then it should show up on the language, and it does.
That's right. Yeah.
So then we have to have a way that we can actually approach language from that other perspective. Okay.
Yeah, it gives us a lot of
And then,
insights into
exactly.
other people.
And then that gets us into, like you said, the function of it. So then you start looking at people who philosophically said, well, why do humans have language? And is language something that is given to us by some spiritual being outside? Is it something that's biological, nature-wise? Is it something that is scientific? And that's what was going on back in the 1800s in America, in the United States. They were called the American philosophers. But anyway, they were the pragmatists. And so they were asking those questions. And, my favorite person in that time, of course, is Charles Peirce. And it's spelled like Pierce, but he pronounced it Peirce. Charles Saunders Peirce, C.S. Peirce. And what was interesting is that he said, wait a minute, hold on, because he kind of wanted to step away from that structure too. He said, we need to take a look at language in terms of what it means in terms of communication. Okay.
Which is the point.
Yeah.
One would think.
Yeah.
Right? To communicate our thinking.
Exactly.
To share ideas, to, have what we have exist throughout time when we write it.
Exactly.
I mean, all those things. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. That makes sense. Like,
And
what is communication?
Exactly.
How does it function? Yeah.
So, first of all, I have to have the opportunity to communicate.
That's true, because if you're yelling on a street corner at no one, it's a little odd.
Yeah, it is. And exactly.
Like there has to be that purpose, right?
Right.
Of
And
communication.
then, especially in the first years, once you get a full grammar, then you can use language yourself to inform yourself. But before you get to that adult stage, okay, when you're just acquiring the language, you not only have to have a purpose, but you have to express an intention. You intend, I'm hungry. I want something to eat. And no, I don't want burritos. I want something else. I want milk or whatever it happens to be. And I have
or
to.
in the case of my son, no broccoli.
No broccoli, exactly. And the thing is that we have to, if we live in isolation, we don't have language, we don't have a need for language. We live in a restricted environment, that's restricted by the hills and by the water, and we don't ever travel, we don't bring the world into us, we don't have any computers, TVs, smartphones, nothing like that. So then we also don't need a language that's highly complex. But the more complex your environment is, and we have moved in this United States from being a rural country where the majority of people live in the rural communities to being a country in which the majority of people live now in the cities.
So what you're saying is that, let's say in 1860,
Right.
the average person was living on a farm, or somewhere like that.
Absolutely.
And they were pretty isolated. They had maybe they're a large family, maybe,
Right.
but they weren't traveling 500 miles. They weren't using atlases and maps. They weren't using Wikipedia.
They had maps, but
they
were
but
restricted.
Very restricted.
Yeah, they didn't have a need for them.
You weren't. I mean, I've heard those stories of my great grandmother never went more than 100 miles from where
home.
they were born.
That's right.
And so if that's your life, what were 7-year-olds doing? They were out in the fields.
Exactly.
They were picking up rocks.
Exactly.
They were catching fish.
Exactly.
Did they need to, be able to process advanced literature? No. Did most people?
No.
Most people didn't, right?
No.
They had to do some basic sums, maybe.
Right.
Sign their name. Maybe
somebody put their X.
Maybe
Because
somebody.
I've got some stuff from my great grandparents and their X's.
Maybe they learned their basic letters on their horn books, right? And they, someone could read.
And often what would happen is that they would say, "This is what I want to say." Even in their classrooms, they would do that. In the little schools, they would do that. And so then the person who could write would write it for them, so they could see it, and then they would say it back, read what was written, which sounds familiar for a classroom, doesn't it? Okay, and we call that tagging, and then they mark it, and then the person and you read it back, and the person knows it because they had the language for it to begin with.
Right.
They had the language. And all they wanted you to do was put it in a visual form so that somebody else could pick it up at the other end.
But the whole world was so much different. But
absolutely.
But tell me if I'm wrong, but biologically as humans, our brains haven't changed significantly in the last.
Yes, they have.
Because they've had to.
Yes, they had to. And they
we've
have
had
changed.
to.
Even in the last 3 generations, in the last 60 years, our brains have
changed a
changed
bit.
significantly.
Yeah.
And there's data and research that shows that.
So, but
have they gotten smarter? Well,
maybe not.
But they have from a research standpoint in terms of taking a test, because you can produce all those patterns that you can imitate. And we've gotten really good at doing that. But we do it at the expense, those structures are at the expense of those functions.
So our language functioned differently when our environment was more restricted.
And it's still true.
Right.
There's still, we're linguists who are out there in the field are still finding groups of people that have their own little language.
Oh, yeah. There's even pockets in Appalachia still, right?
Right.
Still, or even some of the Louisiana islands.
Yeah.
Some places where they're still even doing a pidgin of native languages.
And in a
French.
lot of places in the world, you actually have 5 languages by the time you get to the university level. A lot of my international students, they have the language of their community, of their home, Okay, and that would be a specific language for a small group, a clan, a tribe, an island in Alaska. It would be their own individual language of that group. Okay?
Yeah.
And then once they moved out of that to the marketplace, they had to be able to barter, buy, et cetera, in the marketplace. So they had to pick up a language that would be there. And then that language in that marketplace, when they traded and went into the city, then it had to be a language that was in the city, so it would be a regional language. And then they would go to school, and that language would be something in the school. I just met a couple of guys that they can't talk in English, they can't talk in their native languages, but they share Hebrew. And the reason they share Hebrew is because they went to schools that was the language of the school, Hebrew.
Right.
And some of my international students from Africa would have French. Okay, so that was their academic language. But then they also had to take another language, usually like English, okay, because they planned to travel or go to another place. So that by the time they came to university level, they had 4 or 5 languages easily.
But each one functioned for a different purpose, doesn't it?
Well, it sort of does, but each one,
kept
but it
growing.
also becomes, the global languages actually become much more complex, because the parallel to that is not only the brain growth, but the parallel to that is that the social networks also reflect the need for the language. So if you are living out in the woods, you don't have a need too much for complex language.
Right.
Okay? But if you're living in a city, if you're living in a town, if your kids are coming to an elementary school where there's at least 25 kids,
Yep.
you have a social network, even in individual classrooms or individual social networks. That social network has to have a parallel language network that's neurosemantic. And those have to be built upon the neurosemantic circuits, which are the ideas and the concepts.
Wait, so then the more of those layers of or systems that they had to learn, the
meaning.
more efficient their brain's getting,
Absolutely.
and the more they're coming with. That's
Right.
more neural networks that have more
get-
efficiency,
right.
that have more potential for finding connections in the new things as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because they don't have to grow in a physical, structural sense. They have to be efficient in the way in which they connect.
Nice.
And that's the connectedness that takes place within the brain. All right, that the human brain is capable of, and the other animals are not.
See, I would love to talk about that for a few minutes, because other people are like, well, dolphins learn language, so it'd be fun to talk about that.
Yeah, maybe we ought to pick that up.
Yeah.
We're
We're kind of getting to, we kind of want to start wrapping up, but I want to pick up also with more about Peirce and what he said about language.
Oh yeah, we'll definitely do that.
So what nugget are we leaving people with today?
Well,
What do we wanna-
first of all, we need to summarize a little bit. So
Yeah.
the 2 main approaches that I see to looking at language, studying it, approaching it, doing experiments in neuroscience, looking at it from an educational curriculum standpoint, are the structural structural approach, which we talked about. And then you called it functional, and that would be acquisition approach. In other words, the developmental structures come as a result of the acquisition. So we need to understand how it is that we actually learn. And in acquisition, we have communication, which has to do with pragmatics. And we actually have the ability to use that communication in a variety of ways. And the more complex it becomes, the more symbolic it becomes.
Correct.
And so that is our semiotics. That's our purpose of having language to begin with.
And that we understand those different situations and how to use it. And that's also
Absolutely.
in the brain as well.
And that's semantic.
Yeah,
and that's our
semantic.
meaning.
Yeah.
So we have to get beyond the structures, the syntax, morphology, phonology, that kind of stuff. And we have to get into the semantics, the pragmatics, and the semiotics, which is the Peirce, the stuff that you alluded to, and that type of thing. So, as you go about this week, think about how you use your language. What do you use your language for? I'll give you an example. I had a gentleman that had lost the function of his larynx, which is the vibration part for speech. And so he really couldn't talk anymore. He had to learn a different way of doing it, and he didn't want to learn a different way. So he climbed up on a ladder to hammer something, and he hit his thumb and smashed his thumb. And he was so upset, and he wanted to be able to curse or say something about ouch about hitting his thumb.
That's a nice way to say it.
And he couldn't do it. And he had to run down the ladder and run across the room and grab his vibrator that was on his neck. They use a larynx vibrator, or he did at the time. Now they have some other ways to do that. But anyway, and he had to put that on, and he said, okay, I'm learning a different way to talk. Language communicates a lot of different things, everything from a pain, what I need, what I want, to ideas.
So do we want people to think about how many ways they use their language?
Yeah.
How many purposes do we use our language for?
Yeah. Or how does your language affect the behavior of others? How does your language affect the ideas of others? How does your language affect the beliefs of others? Okay. In other words, how are you using your language in your communication? All right, we're going to say goodbye and thank you for watching. And if you want to see more of what we're doing, you're welcome to look at our pages, Bonnie Robb and Ellen Lucas Arwood online. You're also welcome to look at NeuroEd Press with Chris Meredith. He also puts out a lot of our information.
Yeah, and we'll try to provide links to some of, like, if we're name dropping these researchers, we'll try to provide you some links to some of the bibliography, but primary sources, because what we really try to do is look at primary sources as opposed to other people's interpretations, because that's where we get the, that real solid information from.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So use your language, grow your brain.
That's right.
All right. Bye.